Okay, so once again, hello, Jasmine. It's so nice to have you here today. And let's start.
Great, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm always happy to talk about our program, and I will share my screen and get started. All right. So let me just move things around a little bit so I can see my situation. Okay. Okay, so I will be speaking today about specifically about Stanford University Press and our digital initiative, with the hopes that that all of this information will be applicable to digital publishing in general. So my experience is specific to this university press, but there are many other programs that are developing and evolving that are also taking on some of the challenges that we're dealing with. So hopefully this is applicable to more than just our story at the press here. So I want to start with a little bit of personal introduction just to provide some context about my experience and perspective on this topic. So I received a PhD from the University of Texas in Austin in 2011, and I started my digital humanities career in a graduate program that was at its foundation pretty typical and traditional, but it was enhanced by a growing focus on digital studies. And so though my PhD is formally in English, my emphasis was actually in a concentration known as digital literacies and literature. And during my grad program, I worked in the digital writing and research lab there at UT, and I took classes in things like the accessibility and the virtual body, computers and writing, and I was taking classes in this at the same time that I was conducting some pretty traditional research in the Harry Ransom Center in their archives. So I was working specifically with James Joyce, and my dissertation then was on Joyce, and it was a pretty traditional dissertation, very linear text, but it had included a digital appendix that allowed me to illustrate some of the points that I was making in my traditional dissertation, which was about Joyce and multimodality. So it allowed me to illustrate some of what I was arguing that I couldn't really otherwise present in typical linear text form. So after graduating, I spent 5 years as a visiting assistant professor of English and began pursuing my scholarship. But instead of doing the typical first project that most scholars do, turning the more traditional body of the dissertation into a first monograph publication, I pursued what I considered to be the much more exciting, interesting, and necessary work of expanding on the appendix and turning that into a full-blown digital humanities research project. And this project was the Mapping Dubliners project, and it became my main scholarly focus. This is just kind of clicking through the project. So after initially setting up, well, let me back up just a little bit. So the project started as essentially I read through Dubliners, James Joyce's Dubliners, and as I read, I created a Google map of all of the 200 geographical references in the text. So it was a very manual experience. I wasn't trying to do anything more than map the locations for my own purposes, but what it turned into was something much more. So after initially setting up that map, I started adding essays, usually about one a week. These essays would analyze one of the places in more detail, in terms of the historical and political significance of what it meant that Joyce mentioned it in his text. So this choice had some pretty heavy consequences, focusing on a digital project rather than on a book. Basically 5 years after graduating with my PhD, I had written nearly 90 essays for my project, but I was still working as a visiting assistant professor, non-tenure track, at a research university, and seeing the positions that I could have filled given to scholars who did have those more traditional publications. Or maybe they didn't have them yet, but they were working on them. So my final year at that university, I attended a digital humanities convening at one of the state's sister universities. And there I heard a presentation by Nick Bauk, who had just published a digital project, much like my own, on a different topic, of course. But his project was a completely digital project. And it was published by Stanford University Press. This was in 2016, and it was the first time I had ever heard of a university press publishing a completely digital project. And so my interest was piqued, of course. And about a month later, I saw a job posting for the press that they were looking for a digital production associate. So although I had no experience in publishing, I was coming from the scholar's end rather than a publisher's perspective or experience. Because of my experience developing a digital project and my perspective in the academy, I had some of the credentials essentially that they were looking for. This position was a totally new position. There was nothing like it at other presses yet. So the press wasn't even sure what exactly my role would be. And that evolved over time, of course, once I did get the job a few months later, and I joined the program. So the program started in 2016, and instead of taking you through the full kind of description of what it was and how it evolved, I'm just gonna share this video, which is a promotional video about the program, which was released when the program started, to kind of explain what we were doing. And I will play that.
About 3 years ago, we were looking into what we could do at the press to more tightly bind what we're doing to the newer initiatives that are taking place on campus. And we were also consulting faculty about what they needed out of the publisher on campus. What they wanted was something completely new.
The reason we undertook the Interactive Scholarly Works program at the Stanford University Press was really to make it possible for there to be peer-reviewed, technically reviewed, interactive scholarly works from the digital humanities and computational social sciences communities that might be useful in considerations for appointments, promotions, and tenures in academic institutions.
What we wanted to do was create a parallel stream to our book program that allowed these digital objects to be formally published. We needed resources to do that, and we were really grateful to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for giving us the generous grant that has allowed us to get full-time employees within the press who can dedicate their time to actually thinking about these hard questions.
We're looking for projects that make use of web technology to make arguments in novel ways. Our goal is to support scholars who are already working in the computational medium to publish their work in the same medium in which they're conducting their research. We are focusing on projects that make arguments, that offer an interpretation, and they're united by being visually driven, interactive, and multimodal.
So the main reason that my project cannot be published in a print format as easily is this notion of pairing different media. Enchanting the Desert is based on a single historical document, which is a 45 photograph slideshow made in the early 20th century by a photographer named Henry Peabody. And in Enchanting the Desert, I create a geography of this photographic portrait of the Grand Canyon, which helps visually investigate the processes of cultural transformation in the region at that time. So it's a project that's based on photography and an attendant cartography. As the pilot author in Stanford University Press's digital publishing initiative, so I was really interested in working with editors who were flexible in the way that I approached building the site. That's something that was really valuable to me and that I think the editors and the team and the designers at Stanford University Press were really good at giving me leeway to make sure that my authorial voice came through in the design of the website.
So we start our conversations quite early with authors. We work with authors on creating a proposal. Proposals are quite similar to book proposals, but we ask that they include explanations of the technical aspect of the project. We look for 3 to 4 reviewers, and those reviewers cover a range of aspects. We seek scholars who work in the same content as our authors, and we seek scholars who have experience in creating these kind of digital projects to think through presentation methods and structure of scholarship, of argument.
What do my colleagues think of this? What do they make of it? How do they want me to improve upon this? Do they think it should even see the light of day? I think those are absolutely necessary dimensions of critical scholarship. And what I love about the new initiative at Stanford University Press is that it brings in spatial history, social network analysis, various aspects of DH, but it also merges them together with critical, long-standing practices of peer review. China in the contemporary period is undergoing almost unimaginably rapid and complex change. And one of these changes that captured my attention is the mass relocation of human remains. And so collaborating with a team here at Stanford University, led by my colleague David McClure, we built the first ever spatial history augmented narrative platform to capture, describe, and try to tell some of the stories that come out of this phenomenon. It has been truly eye-opening. Working with Stanford University Press has been tremendous. This is an initiative that not just any press, however prestigious, can undertake and execute as precisely and with as much vision as SUP has.
So once we've awarded a contract, we work closely with an author to develop the project until publication. So far, it's been a closer process than it has been in the print world. We go back and forth with the author, with our technical team, with their technical team, to really create a publication that fits our needs as publishers, as well as the author's needs as scholarly communicators.
Unlike print publications, the development of this project has been a collaborative effort at every step of the way, and has brought me into the orbit of some extraordinary technologists at my home institution, and has introduced me to a broader network of digital humanists. The basic idea behind my project is to draw attention to the oral poetic traditions of the Mahara of Yemen and Oman, roughly 200,000 people who have maintained their unwritten indigenous language, and this in the face of a broad historical trend towards the adoption of Arabic in the Middle East and especially on the Arabian Peninsula. Going further, the project aims to provide a window onto how poetry is formulated in a strictly oral context. And this is achieved through an interactive display that will allow visitors to the site to walk through the process of poetic creation, from the moment of initial inspiration to final considerations. So this type of curated exploration of the process would be virtually impossible to recapitulate in a print monograph.
Upon publication, we work with our marketing team to advertise the project, to promote it through similar channels as our print publications. We also work with Stanford libraries to archive our projects, to offer long-term sustainability for them and long-term access for projects.
And that's something that we really wanted to consider for this program, because a publication really becomes a valid academic publication through its longevity. If we were to be publishing these and having them go dead within 2 years, that really wouldn't serve the purposes of the academic community. We want them to have the same kind of permanence as a print publication.
This publication means a great deal for my academic career. It's really important for 3D scholarly content that it can be evaluated and accessed by my peers in the larger field. My project uses a 3D model and geographic information systems to investigate the ancient Egyptian necropolis of Saqqara. So my project can't be published in a print format because it is three-dimensional, it's dynamic, it's experiential, and it considers things like shape, color, texture and movement through spaces in this 3D world. So that's something that just really can't be expressed on black and white in between the covers of a book. Stanford University Press is interested in doing some creative things, and they're willing to publish something where we don't actually know what the outcome is going to be yet. So they're taking some risks, and I think that's an exciting place to be.
So the biggest challenge has been that we're starting this program from scratch. There's nobody else doing anything like this. So we had to think through some very basic questions. Questions like, what kind of projects can we support within the workflow of our publishing processes? What kind of projects can we peer review? What do scholars need from us?
The goal here is that this isn't only a learning opportunity for Stanford University Press. This is a learning opportunity for all of scholarly publishing. And we've committed to being as open as we possibly can about our processes, the problems that we've encountered, and the solutions that we have developed for each of these issues as we encounter them.
So why should Stanford be involved in this? And that has to do with the integration of Stanford as a generative element itself in Silicon Valley, and then the influence of Silicon Valley and all these disruptive or potentially disruptive technologies coming to the toolkit of ordinary mortals.
And so if venturing into DH feels anxiety producing or uncertain, just know that there are already a whole lot of great and brilliant people there ready to meet you at the door and work alongside you towards something you didn't even know was possible.
All right, thanks for your patience with that. So that gives you kind of an overview of the program itself and kind of what it was hoping to accomplish at its outset. That promotional video was made the first year of the program in 2016. And since then, we've learned a lot. Although the objectives have remained the same, some of how we have gone about achieving those objectives has really evolved just based on the challenges that we've encountered along the way. And there have been many. But in total, we have, I think, produced some very strong scholarly publications, as well as developed some workflows that hopefully can be picked up and used and supported by other presses going forward. So from the outset, from 2016 to now, from 2016 to by the middle of this year, we will have published 16 fully digital interactive scholarly works. So what we've been able to publish has increased quite a bit in the last couple of years. But what you're seeing in terms of the volume is really indicative of how long these digital projects take to develop and how long it takes to build a brand new publishing program. So at Stanford University Press is about 120 years old. It's been around for a long time. It's well established. The book program is well established. But adding a very different kind of program to an existing program takes time. By the time we acquire a project, we still need to go through editorial development. We need to build the reach of the program, awareness of the program, and bringing in new authors and developing their projects does take some time. So the idea was initially to be able to publish 10 projects a year. And of course, that's just not feasible with a brand new program. But as you can see, we've developed the capacity to be able to publish more as time has gone on. And of course, that little blip in 2021 is indicative of the pandemic in 2020, when a lot of development sort of slowed down or stopped altogether. there was a lot of other things going on in people's lives, and they just weren't developing projects as quickly. So the grant itself has seen 2 rounds of funding. The first round really focused on everything that was talked about in the video. The second round, which began in 2019, sought to simply continue the program, but also to give more focus to preservation and archiving, and to really establish the publications that we already had put out into a longer life cycle, and to develop the new projects that we were doing with preservation at the forefront. So I want to go through and maybe talk specifically about some of the grant objectives, which were the publishing workflow, preservation, and business models, and momentum and reach. And so I want to frame the rest of this discussion basically through those objectives, and hopefully that'll add a little bit of clarity to kind of these different processes. All right, so one of the key objectives was to basically just develop a parallel process for publishing digital projects that mapped almost identically to the print process. So if other presses are going to adopt programs like this to support digital initiatives, then we wanted it to be clearly mappable onto what they were used to being able to publish and what they were used to doing, the work they were used to doing. So our goal was to really make these parallel streams. And so some of that is fairly possible, especially in the editorial process, the acquisitions process. As Frederica mentioned in the video, there were a lot of similarities between those 2 processes. And where things started getting trickier was when it came to peer review. So to start with the editorial workflow for a print book, the workflow is pretty linear. It's very well established. First, an author submits a proposal, or an editor invites a proposal, and then an author works on developing this proposal, and the author submits that. The editor then accepts it and invites a manuscript. The author submits a manuscript, and then it goes through peer review. So peer review becomes a little bit trickier when you're dealing with digital projects because there are different factors that need to be considered when reviewing a digital project. So not only were we looking for reviewers who could speak to the contributions of the subject area, but we also needed reviewers who had a sense of digital humanities, digital social sciences, and were able to look at the implications of how the argument was structured in the digital medium, how it made use of digital potentialities, how it organized and structured these things in an interactive way. So the peer reviewers had to come from maybe not just the subject area side, but the digital side as well. And the questions that we would ask the reviewers really depended on the project itself. And so we would work with the authors to actually come up with some of the aspects that they wanted feedback on, and then, as well as ask the reviewers the typical questions that we would ask in any scholarly publication. So once the reviews came back, we would, just like with a book program, we would summarize and encapsulate those, bring them back to the authors, give the authors then time to make edits and revisions and perhaps like restructure things according to what the suggestions were. So this becomes a little bit tricky with a digital project because oftentimes digital projects are funded, excuse me, by development grants. So if a project comes to us at the press already, 75% developed, say, or already developed in a specific platform. And then the feedback from the reviewers is that really this platform doesn't work, then that means the author then needs to go back to the center or their developers or whoever they're working with, if it's not just them doing it themselves, and request more time and more resources to make those changes. So of course, this introduces more challenges for the author, and then it extends the development process if those changes are super complicated. And yeah, so it'll typically take longer than to do revisions in a digital project than it would, say, in a book. Once those revisions are done, though, it goes to the editorial board at the press, just like a book project does. And then once it's approved, then we begin making coming up with a contract. So I was showing the print workflow. The digital workflow all of this is maybe worded a little bit differently, but essentially it's pretty similar. The reason that I have a different kind of visual here is that the digital workflow tends to be a bit more collaborative and a bit more iterative. And so my colleague who developed this visualization, Nicole Coleman, she really was aiming to capture this idea of the layers of people who are involved. So not only do you have like the author and the editor as you do in the print workflow, but you also now have the design and development team. You have further internal reviews at the press that deal with the technology that's powering a project. So there's a bit more back and forth. And in fact, the production, you'll see that the production line comes in here much earlier than it does in the print process. So myself, as the digital production manager, I would typically come in these early stages and start looking at a project and look at what technologies it's using and determine whether or not we could support those technologies, whether the author was using proprietary tools, and whether we wanted to have them switch over to open source tools and things like that. So these decisions need to be made early on, and therefore the production, the technical team, which is the production team at the press, needs to be aware earlier on of what a project looks like. So during contract negotiation and before transmittal in a book project, typically an author of a book continues to develop the manuscript. Meanwhile, sales and marketing begin looking at the project and its reach, how they can best bring a book to market. Production begins looking at the cover art possibilities, and then the editor reviews the final manuscript, and editorial assistants begin working on compiling all of the artwork and checking the rights. Similarly, all of that still goes on with the digital project, but there are a few more steps added. So the key step here is that we need to migrate a project from an author's development server to the press server, so that we can then have full access to technical editing and archiving later down the road. So in order to assess whether that migration is going to go smoothly, we need to kind of do like a test run of that. So we do a migration analysis where I, as the production manager, would gain access to the author's content management system, or maybe their GitHub repo, or whatever it is that they're working in to develop their project. And I would sort of like do a walkthrough and figure out what we're going to need to set up on our servers, which server we're going to need to use to host the project, etc. So again, I mentioned the kind of back and forth that has to happen between the editor at the press and the author's development team to make these kind of more substantive changes to the structure and the architecture of the project. Again, the challenge here is usually funding. The press would not necessarily fund this unless we had a special request to do so, and we could, you know, pull some resources together perhaps to help with some of that. One example of this type of change that I'm talking about would be, we had one project that was built in WordPress, and WordPress is notoriously prone to breakages if you're using a theme that becomes unsupported in the future. So an author was using WordPress more out of just convenience for the way that it helped them build the project and add content to it. But in the end, that whole entire WordPress apparatus wasn't necessary for the publication. So we migrated that. We asked the author to migrate it to a different content management system, one that is more parallel to sort of the press objectives of, you know, having an editorial layer. So they switched it to Scalar. Another example would be having videos all in YouTube. We want all of any kind of media to be local to a project so that it's not, it doesn't require a third-party dependency to be able to be viewed in the project. So we had all these YouTube videos downloaded and then transferred to the press so that we could then load them on our own server, and then serve the project locally from one space rather than drawing from all of these external sources. So the key differences, again, for the editorial and development workflows were the addition of an internal technical review, the differences in the peer review, so the more specific kind of questions related to the technology and the navigation and the interactive elements of the project. And then, of course, the development costs for the author. Production is probably where there's the most kind of deviation from the typical print workflow. A print workflow during the production process is pretty standard in that production, there's a transmittal. The production editor begins kind of coding and tagging manuscript. They send the manuscript to a copy editor. The copy editor edits it, sends it back to the press. The press reviews that, sends it to the author. The author accepts and rejects changes, responds to queries, sends that back to the press. That goes back to the copy editor for cleanup, comes back to the press, and then there are proofs and different stages of proofing and review. Art is inserted. There is cover design, typesetting, things like that. Some of that stuff is done internally. Sometimes it's sent out to freelancers or to vendors. And then there is the printing and binding process, which usually takes about a month, and that's the actual material making of the book itself. The digital workflow for production is quite different. So the only same process is the copy editing, but even then, that has to take a different form. So since the projects are coming to us already built into a platform, then a copy editor needs to be able to work within that platform to be able to make the edits. So depending on the project, this might be pretty straightforward. If you've ever used the Scalar platform, then that's an example of a platform that is geared toward the editorial process for publications. There are text boxes in there that contain all of the content and different roles that you can assign for the users. So there's the author, there's the editor, and there's readers and various other roles. So an editor can actually work in Scalar, make changes, and those changes will be tracked so that then the author logs in and they can see what changes have been made, accept and reject them, etc. Sometimes it's not that straightforward though. So if an author is using a custom built application, just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, then we will need to copy edit like code files, HTML files, basically. So we need copy editors who are not afraid of that, who are familiar enough with HTML to be able to recognize what tags are, what tags can or should be edited, what to stay away from. Yeah, every project is different in our program. So we really have to make that determination based on the platform or the format itself. Every once in a while, we will actually convert a project's text to Word documents and have a copy editor just work in Word documents. But even then, you have to make sure that you gather all of the text in a project, including, menu items and little pop-ups and things like that. So it's quite time consuming actually to go through and gather all of that text, even if you are going to just convert it and let a copy editor work in a more comfortable kind of setting. So beyond that, though, there's a pretty hefty technical cleanup phase. So typically after copy editing, which usually takes a month, the author then has the project back for copy edit review, which is another month. And then I would get I would start working on copy edit cleanup. So working in any changes that the author couldn't make themselves, and cleaning up any code that got messed up during copy editing. And then that would take typically 2 to 3 weeks. And then we would begin technical cleanup, where we need to do anything from converting file formats to migrating third-party dependencies to like just fixing random tags and just fixing all those little things. And that always differs based on the project itself. And that's another month. And then we do go through some proofing. And meanwhile, we do have external designers design and put together a cover page. So the key differences again are the copy editing, the addition of the technical editing phase. But of course, we don't have a manufacturing phase. We're not actually putting together a physical book, a physical object. So all of that kind of what would be considered manufacturing in the print side becomes technical editing in the digital side. We also have the process of registering projects for DOIs and in inputting the metadata for the projects into WorldCat so that they are discoverable through libraries. Another key point on here that I didn't add in was migration. So this step of actually moving the project from the author's home server to the press's server. And that can be about a 2-week process. So just another version of another kind of visualization that maps the process. So here we have sort of like the long and winding road from acquisitions to publication. And each of these layers represents different roles and different people who have to be involved. So as you can see, it's a very collaborative process. And it all leads to, I know it's a little bit hard to see here, but if you were to look closely, you would see that actually publication is not at the end. Publication actually happens somewhere towards the end, but there's a lot that still happens after publication. And that's where preservation comes in. So as one of the key objectives of the SUP grant, preservation was something that we really spent a lot of time on. And I personally spent a lot of time on these questions. And this is one of those areas that that it became clear was necessary sort of after I started. So my original title I mentioned was digital production associate. So when I came onto the press in 2016, it was assumed that I would basically be evaluating projects in terms of their platforms and their technical assets to determine whether they were sustainable. And I would also be in charge of coordinating like copy editing. Beyond that, it really wasn't certain what all would need to be done. And so preservation really evolved as a major focus of what I would be doing, because in order to ensure that something is sustainable, you have to actually know it's archivable and preservable. So I began exploring early on kind of the best approaches to to preserving and archiving and making these projects last, so that, as Alan mentioned in the video, they didn't die in 2 years and they remain part of the scholarly record for at least as long as a book would, hopefully. So after a lot of research and a lot of testing and a lot of thinking and a lot of talking to other people in the world of preservation, we came up with these 3 kind of approaches to preserving each digital project. So each publication, we have 3 different versions of, in terms of its archival version. We have preservation and publication. We have the web archive, and we also store the project code in a digital repository. So I'll talk about these in a little bit more depth, and I'll save preservation and publication till the end because it kind of brings the other 2 together. So web archiving. Web archiving was assumed in our grant to be the most obvious way to preserve and persist these digital projects. Because all of these projects are web-based, it makes sense that a web archive would be the most obvious path toward archiving it. And this is still true. It retains the perceived fidelity of the interactive features. So if you look at a web archive version of a website, it should it should act exactly the same as a typical, like the original version of the project. And when you actually perform web archiving on a project, you have granular control over what you capture. So it allows you to kind of go deep into a website and ensure that you're capturing all of the content if you use the right kind of tools anyway. It does change the back end of a project, so it's no longer, a web archive is no longer the full stack of code files and the full structure of a website, what sits on a server. Instead, it becomes kind of a flattened file, but that flattened file retains the experience on the front end for the user of what the original was. There are direct and free access to some of the tools. We use Web Recorder, which is really like the perfect, here's the Web Recorder logo. It's the perfect tool for us because we can do that manual capture, whereas tools like Archivit are a bit more automated and you can't necessarily be certain you're capturing everything. But there are a bunch of tools out there, and we've kind of researched each of them to figure out that Web Recorder was the best one. It's also potentially a publication format itself, although we're not necessarily identifying the web archive of a project as the publication itself. At some point, when the live web version of a project dies, we will roll over to the web archive and serve the web archive as the publication itself. So, you know, that does introduce the idea of potentially publishers publishing web archives instead of live websites, which I think could be a great idea. A web archive, of course, does carry its own maintenance considerations. You do need to have a web archive player, and you need to be able to maintain that. So, the Stanford Digital Repository. So this is a different preservation approach that we take. So every project has a web archive, but every project also has a collection in the Stanford Digital Repository. So this basically means that we take what's sitting on the server on the public HTML directory, we zip that up and deposit it into the repository so that it is preserved. All of its bits essentially are preserved. So these code files are specific to the project itself, the individual project. It may contain anything from the code itself to data files or project databases, as well as any media that's in the project. So video, images, audio, 3D files. So on top of all of this, though, because if someone were to come across this stuff in a repository, it may not make obvious sense what it is. We also attach documentation and a screencast. So the documentation is essentially a description of the project. It includes the technical specs, like what browser versions were in use during the time that it was published, what dependencies are needed. So usually JavaScript needs to be enabled in a browser, whether a project really needs to have audio, speakers, or, a video player or something like that. And then as part of this documentation, we ask our authors to write up a user experience. So it's essentially a long, it could be 2 or 3 pages long, just a description of what happens when a reader goes into a project and clicks through it and what they see. So part of this documentation then also includes a screencast of the author actually clicking through the project as they narrate what's going on. And then this all comes together in what we consider the preservation in publication. So for each of our projects, we have kind of 2 spaces. And this is kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, so I won't go too deep into it. But essentially, we have a website that is the cover page, the cover package. And then we have the website that is the project itself. So the formula basically is, so for instance, this project is Layered Lives. The cover package sits at layeredlives.org. The project contents itself sits at layeredlives.supdigital.org. So what a reader sees when they go to layeredlives.org, the cover page is a cover page, and there's an enter button, and then there is an archive button. So if they click on the archive button, they actually have access then to everything that we have created in terms of the archive versions. So the web archive is accessible from this page. The repository collection is accessible from this page. And then there is an HTML version of the documentation with the screencast there. So if a reader wants to not even enter the project itself, but rather they would like to see what all archival versions of it exist, they can do that from the cover page. And I do, let's see, quickly want to just show an example of that. So here's the Layered Lives project. So this is the cover page. You can click the enter button and you notice that the URL there changed. So this is the project itself. If you go back to the cover page though, you'll see up here a link to archive, and that's where you see this page here that I mentioned. So you can click on the web archive. This goes to what almost looks identical to the project itself, and it will actually act identically as a website. This is just, again, the example of a web archive and what a web archive looks like. It's the most direct kind of high fidelity copy of the project. But also the repository collection, you can go there. So here is the collection level abstract. And let's see, you could also look at the contents list, what all is actually in that repository collection. You have the documentation, the screencast, the web archive, and the project code and content. So if you were to click on any of these, it would take you to the object in the repository. So this is the PDF documentation. But also, as I mentioned, there is a HTML version of the documentation, and that's here. This is the long description of the project, user experience, full of screenshots and narrative, and then the screencast itself.
I'm Taylor Arnold. Courtney River, Lauren Tilton and I panel, and a map of the southeastern United States and bibliographic citations.
So
links are given.
That's the author talking and narrating his click-through. So we have this for each of our projects. So Filming Revolution, they all look a little bit different. The cover pages, they're all styled appropriately to their content. but they all contain this similar archive options. All right, so the reach of the project, we really wanted to engage the community. We wanted to be transparent about what we were doing. We wanted to share what we were doing, share the challenges, share the achievements, in hopes that other presses might find it useful for potentially developing their own programs, digital programs over time. So we attended lots of conferences. We developed partnerships, for instance, with Web Recorder. We collaborated on a lot of other projects, kind of similar projects, many related to preservation, such as the emulation as a service infrastructure. There's a preserving new formats project headed at NYU that sought to look at creating guidelines for authors and publishers who are creating these things to make them more preservable. We helped develop a library publishing curriculum based on our experiences. We do webinars like this. And we also created a guidelines package that's available on the press website. And this gives, guidelines for how to create projects that are archivable, that have clear documentation, that properly cite digital labor, and that use links and file formats and fonts, images, colors correctly. So these should be useful to authors who are creating digital projects, whether they're for our press or another press, or just for self-publishing. So the larger effects have included 10-year review guidelines that have now been developed by, for instance, American History Association and the Modern Languages Association. Both of those have developed guidelines for 10-year review committees to use to evaluate digital projects as publications that are as robust and rigorous as print publications. We've also influenced the development of web archiving tools that are specific to digital publications. We've basically created greater visibility of how important preserving projects in production is. And we've brought kind of what we're doing to those preservation communities so that they understand that this is a type of thing that is in need of proper preservation. So they're aware that it exists and that they need to pay attention to it. So the maybe one of the biggest challenges, the most challenging objective we had was to figure out a business model for these publications. So of course we thought about the idea of subscription-based approach, which would mean that readers would have to pay for access to these projects, whether that was an institution basically subscribing to the full list, or we could do it, project by project, basically sell access to them. But the problem with that was that a lot of the authors that were coming to us had already received development grants that stipulated that their outcomes needed to be open access. And I know there are similar initiatives in the works more largely in the US for these types of projects that are funded through these grant agencies. And I know that in Europe, all of this already exists with Plan S. And so there really is a driving kind of mandate to publish these open access. So if that's the case, then really the challenge became like how to fund that open access program. The publisher costs are, pretty consequential. In our case, the model looked like this. We had a staff of 2. So when you're thinking about the costs, you have to consider two salaries. That's a per year cost. In our case, we had an acquisitions editor and a production and preservation manager. And so in addition to that, though, we had per project costs, which were the designer, the freelance designer, the freelance copy editor. And in some cases, we actually contracted for a web archivist to create a web archive. So that's a per project cost. And then another per year cost would be the publication server, so the server that you're hosting the publications on, as well as any fees that you would need to pay to a preservation repository or a service. So whether that's Stanford Digital Repository or whether that's in the US, a lot of publishers use clocks and Portico to make preservation copies. So all of those are pretty significant costs. And so the question then is who pays? So obviously with the subscription model, the readers would pay, but since that's really not viable, either the authors need to pay, and in that case, you know, a project would cost a publisher, I don't know, if we're gonna try to like do the math on all of this, could be $40,000 to $50,000 per project, depending on how many we're publishing a year, et cetera. So an author really is not going to, I mean, are they going to be able to bring that fee in addition to the amount that it already is costing them to develop the project? It doesn't also seem very viable. So then the other options are just to fund the program through grants, which is what we've done. But now as of the end of 2023, our grant funding is done. And now we need to look at further funding sources. So, you know, probably the best one is simply institutional funding, and just to work in these costs to the typical press budget, because, you know, though these projects are open access, they add prestige to the press. They are kind of just a parallel offering to the typical list. And, you know, investing in this program is something that, you know, inevitably will just help the press in the long run. So that's been a lot, I know, and I've gone a little over an hour. So I do want to offer some time, though, for any questions, if anyone has any, and I will stop my sharing at this point. And then